Anyway, welcome to everybody. My name is David Mills, and this is Tuesday afternoon in the UK, and it's another Centre for Global Higher Education webinar. Thank you all for coming. Looking forward to a really interesting conversation. It's a great pleasure, as always, to welcome our guest speakers. And today, I'm delighted to be introducing Yu Zhang from OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Yu Zhang is a postdoctoral fellow, and it's going to be talking about higher education regionalization in East and Southeast Asia. Obviously, we all know a lot about regionalization in a European context because of the Bologna process, but as many of you will know, we've been thinking about these issues beyond Europe, and our Obriel seminar series last year thought about this in relationship to Africa and Latin America. But Zhang, you have the screen and the webinar to introduce your talk, and we look forward to hearing from you and then having a conversation. The screen's yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mills, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate your taking the time for this discussion. I'm gonna share my screen now to see if you'll be able to see. Are you able to see my screen?
That's great. Yes, yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'm gonna start now, and thank you again. My name is Yu Zhang. Please feel free to call me Yo-Yo. I go by Yo-Yo, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present my research on higher education regionalization in East and Southeast Asia. This is part of my doctoral dissertation that I did between 2022 and 2023. I want to start off with setting the context of this research. That is, higher education is influenced by the global processes. As many of you probably know, because of the Center on Global Higher Education, we have this whole dynamic field of research on global higher education. And there are different ways to see global higher education. For example, Zapp and Rambaris talk about the construction of a global higher education regime. Broadly, there is a global agenda on higher education with a lot of organizations, networks that are committed or dedicated to the global agenda. And we also know that in a global higher education field, universities, institutions are competing in a global field, manifested in global rankings, etc. And another way of seeing global higher education, I would say more recently, is to recognize that there is Western dominance and coloniality in global higher education. And broadly, when the research beyond nation state on higher education, I think has mostly focused on the global level, the global processes. And yet there are supranational regional influence in higher education. Regional collaboration is not new. There's always collaboration within the region. But more recently has become more systematic. As you can see from this map I made, probably the most famous or salient one is the European higher education area and the Bologna process. But it's very much a global trend, a global phenomenon, as you can see in different parts of the world, in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. There are initiatives that are aligned with the regionalization of higher education, the supranational regional influence in higher education. So it's very much a global phenomenon. And there are, when I review the literature, there are two very clear definitions to try to understand the supranational regional processes in higher education. There are many other terms, but these two terms are more clearly defined in the literature. The first term is higher education regionalism, um, primarily defined by Troll and the Revenet in 2015, and they talk about these regionalism in higher education as part of the political project of region building. So higher education regionalization policies are part of the broader project of regional integration that may be very relevant in Europe. And there's also a different, relevant, but slightly different ways of seeing regional processes in higher education is seeing it as a process of closer collaboration and alignment among higher education systems within a region, however you define a region. This is mainly proposed by Dr. Jane Knight, and she also talk about there are different approaches to regionalization. For example, functional, mainly referring to different programs, activities that are operating at the regional level. Organizational, meaning there are organizations, networks, and different frameworks operating at the supranational regional level. And lastly, the political, I would say the political interest and the policies that are interested in promoting regionalization in higher education. The political aspect, I would say, is relevant to the concept of regionalism. And in my research, I think of the supranational regional process as more of a process. So I use the term regionalization of higher education in my research. But I do think the regionalism, the political aspect of it is part of the broader process in regionalization. And in reviewing the literature for my doctoral dissertation and also updating it more recently, there are a lot of research that focuses on higher education regionalization as influenced by regional context, regional policies, or involvement of the nation state. So it's very much seen as a regional issue. There are a few things that I think deserves more attention or more research on. The first one is how is the regional processes linked to the global processes? As I have alluded to, it's very much a global phenomenon, not just a regional issue. Many scholars have alluded to the impact of globalization on regionalization, but the specific link of how they are actually interrelated are less understood. And there's not so much research on the role of universities in regionalization. There are a few more recent studies that focus on the institutional and university level, but in general, there's less research on universities. And because the European higher education area, the Bologna process, are very dynamic. So there's so much research on Europe, but not as much research on regions outside of Europe. So for my dissertation, I was trying to understand more broadly, there are two purposes, the link between the regional and the global processes in regionalization in higher education through the lens of regionalization of higher education as a global trend. And I was also interested in the perspectives of universities outside of Europe. And I chose to focus on East and Southeast Asia, primarily because that's a region I am from and I'm more familiar with. And empirically, I try to answer the questions or serve the purpose of the project through the empirical phenomenon of universities participating in regional universities, university associations. So looking at regionalization from an university's perspective and from an organizational perspective. Um, so what are regional university associations? Um, a previous research by Brankvik in 2018 has looked at university associations more broadly, so at the national, regional, and the global level, and she categorized associations as generalist, specialist, and high status associations that I also think applies to regional university associations. So these, more broadly, regional university associations, their members mainly come from the same world region. That's one of the feature of these associations. And another feature is there are different types. So for generalist regional university associations or RUAs, they are more broad access. So the criteria for become members are more in general. So for example, you have to be degree granting institution, you may have to be within the region. But in general, that's the criteria for a more generalist RUAs. An example would be European University Association. Specialist RUAs, they tend to focus on certain organizational traits or disciplines, so their university members share similar organizational traits or disciplinary focus. For example, RUFORUM is an association, regional university association in Africa, and they mainly focus on the agricultural science. And the third type is high status RUAs. So these associations are more exclusive. One of the criteria of therefore being their members is it has to be a prestigious university from their country or globally. An example would be Asian Universities Alliance. This is an regional university association in Asia. And one of the criteria is that their member has to be a reputable university from an Asian country. And according to both previous research and my data collection and research in my doctoral dissertation, there are around 44 RUAs worldwide as of 2022. And I collected data on which universities are members of these RUAs. So globally, there are over 2,200 universities. That's a rough around 13.5% of the universities globally who are RUA members. I also want to show you how this university memberships in regional university associations vary. As you can see in all of the world regions, the universities participate more or less in regional university associations. For example, in Africa, you can see that there are a significant number of universities participating. In South Asia, it's the lowest percentage, only 1% of the universities participating. There are also variations by the type of RUAs universities participate. As is probably makes sense that the higher percentage of universities participating in generalist RUAs, whereas much lower percentage of universities participating in high status RUAs. And as of now, what I'm trying to convey is that seeing from universities participating in regional university associations, which is a supranational regional organization in higher education. It's very much RUA memberships, and more broadly, higher education regionalization is very much a global trend, a global phenomenon. So I'm very interested in understanding why this is a global trend, a global phenomenon, how the regional activities is linked to the global dynamics in higher education. And what I will present is the interview part of the research. The dissertation is a mixed method study, but today I will present on the findings from the interviews, hearing from universities' perspectives of why regional engagement is important and how that is different from global engagement. So one of the questions I was interested in is how do universities in East and Southeast Asia understand their regional engagement? And how is it different from global engagement? And from a conceptual and theoretical perspective, I'm looking at the relationship between region and global from a lens of coloniality. So the underlying assumption of coloniality is that global higher education is built on a colonial and modern higher education, colonial modern system more broadly. So coloniality and modernity are the different sides of the same coin. And more specifically, coloniality refers to the enduring logic of domination that enforces control, management, and exploitation. And these are largely enacted by more powerful groups in the global system on minoritized and peripheral groups in the global system. That's the underlying definition of coloniality. And interrelatedly, there are three different concepts under the broader umbrella of coloniality. There are three different concepts that are related. And so, for example, because of the enduring logic of coloniality that is derived from historical colonialism, there's the view that we should think about decolonization or decoloniality, meaning to overcome the view that a single or primary as epistemic traditions, ways of understanding of the world, such as right now the Western episteme is the only option for thinking about our world or thinking about our global future. However, there are risks or enduring norms that's associated with coloniality. So scholars have talked about the risk of recolonization, meaning that coloniality is a contemporary phenomenon. It's not just historical. The operating logics of the norms and institutions in our current system repeats that of colonialism. This is what's referred to as recolonization, and it's mainly referred to what's happening primarily in nations, cultures, or countries that were colonized or invaded historically. But there's also a concept of self-colonization because it might make sense to think about that the norms of an institution repeat itself in former colonies because of the history, but in cultures not formally colonized or invaded, there is a recognition of Western cultural dominance, even without the historical colonization. And there is a voluntary absorption of the values or categories established by colonization. So Kiyosef refers to as a form of hegemony without domination. So I use these concepts as a lens to interpret the data. And very much these are the concepts that have emerged when I look at the data. So I did interviews with 17 participants who are from 15 universities in East and Southeast Asia, including 10 East Asian universities and 5 Southeast Asia universities. And these are the breakdown of the number of universities by country, and the participants are primarily holding leadership positions in internationalization. So the positions were a director or chief of international office, or responsible for international partnerships, vice president for international. And I specifically chose universities who are engaged, as indicated by their memberships in regional university associations. And this is a more inductive approach in the analysis, and I analyzed the common themes that have emerged in the data. I also want to emphasize that it's a study based on interviews. So it should not be generalized to other regions or even to the whole East and Southeast Asia. And these common themes reflect perspectives from a group of selected individuals in a selected region. So my findings reveal that there are manifestations of decolonization, recolonization, and self-colonization as informed by the theoretical concepts that I introduced earlier. I mainly asked why is regional cooperation or regional engagement important for you, for the university. And among the participants from East Asia, one of the themes that emerged is that they talk a lot about Asia is an important region. For example, because there's cultural diversity in Asia that students should learn more about. For example, this is a quote from a participant in a Chinese university, and they mentioned that we don't need to encourage students to go to Europe or North America to study. However, we do need to encourage our students to go on exchanges in neighboring countries because we are worried about our students might have a narrow understanding of the world. And it's not just the US or Canada that students should learn more about, but a more diverse culture in the world. So they emphasize that students should learn about the cultural diversity in Asia. Another manifestation of the importance of Asia regarded by the participants is that they talk about Asia has become dynamic, has risen in global higher education. For example, a participant from a Japanese university mentioned that for students in Japan, the US or Europe are popular destinations, but a significant number of Japanese students actually want to study in Asia, and because Asia is very dynamic. So this talk about the rise of Asia as a popular destination, and or broadly in research as well, that deserves these regional collaboration and emphasis on regionalization. So I think of this as that in the context of Western dominance in global higher education, this regionalization in East and Southeast Asia reflects, is emphasized as important because of Asia is important and in the context of Western dominance. So this is, I interpret this as a decolonial possibility in global higher education by focusing on the region. There are manifestations of recolonization from participants' comments or views. For example, for some participants I talked to from Southeast Asian universities, they mentioned that regional cooperation is important because it's very accessible and it's more convenient form of internationalization, but they want to go global. For example, a university in Vietnam participant mentioned that it's easy to go from regional, but the university wants to develop and have its print in the world. So they want to be global, but regional, it's easier. And there is an implicit and sometimes explicit preference for collaborating with Western countries. Um, this example is more implicit. So they mentioned that we want to go abroad, we want to be global, we want to go to Italy and Sweden to build our relationships. And that's their understanding of going global. I say this is implicit is they never talked about collaborating with African countries or Latin American countries as part of the going global strategy for the university. So I think of this as a risk of recolonization when collaborating with Western universities are implicitly equal to being global, whereas non-Western regions are not mentioned. This is not to say they shouldn't work with Western university. That is valuable, but there's implicit preference for collaborating with Western universities. And this is an example in Vietnam, which is a nation that was colonized. So I link this more to the concept of recolonization. But interestingly, from the interviews in Thailand, this preference for Western universities are even very explicit when they talk about their internationalization, regional collaboration. For example, a participant from a Thai university mentioned that even for some areas that maybe Malaysia and Indonesia is better than them and they can learn from or they can work with. For the same expertise, they still would like to go to Germany for the same expertise or France. And this participant mentioned specifically or explicitly that this is about geopolitics. It's not just about higher education alone. Because I find this interesting because Thailand is a country or culture that was never formally invaded or colonized. But there's this concept or recognition that the Western universities are seen as better partners compared to regional partners. So coloniality still affects cultures beyond cultures that were formerly colonized or invaded. So the findings that I present is from the interviews. One of the two key takeaways I want hoping to convey today is that seeing from university memberships in regional university associations and also from the literature, higher education regionalization is not just a regional issue, is very much a global trend. And how the regional and global is linked in part from the interviews in East and Southeast Asia. It's linked to coloniality in global higher education. On the one hand, higher education regionalization offers a decolonial option in global higher education by emphasizing the region and the value of Asia. And there, on the other hand, there's also enduring coloniality manifested in recolonization and self-colonization. More broadly, still preferring collaborating with Western countries or Western universities and regarding the regional partners as a convenient way for internationalization. This research has been published in higher education. So if you are interested, please read the article. I'm happy to discuss with you, and I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions, discuss, and critiques. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Yuri. That was really a really good sort of summary of some of your research, your doctorate, and I really like the way in which you draw attention to the participants and their views. So I guess my question to sort of get things going, though, of course, everyone, please do think about your responses and post them in the chat, and I can ask you to come forward. As always, I can ask them for you if you like, but if you post it in the chat, then I'll unmute you because I think currently you are all blocked from unmuting, so I'll do that for you once you post in the chat. So to start with, then. I mean, it seems to me that you are trying to sort of to see the regionalization in this context as both offering a decolonial potential, but also a recolonizing potential. So it seems sort of a bit Janus faced. Is that fair? That it could be both things at the same time? And if it is both things at the same time, is there a problem there with our conceptualization of coloniality? Is it just too broad a concept? And I guess my other question, really following on from that, might be, you didn't particularly comment on relations between members in the region, but did that come up in any negative sense? Because you obviously the emphasis was on by being regionally connected, there is a sense of not sort of prioritizing the West and a very particular historical model of the global. But regions are unequal, and China is a very big and powerful player in this region. Did other countries worry about that, or was that seen as something which seen as a challenge as well as a possibility? So two questions there.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting questions. And yes, I think at least from the findings from the interviews, there's actually both. When universities think about region, both meaning there's recolonization, there's decolonization that seems promising, and then there's also the risks of still preferring Western countries. That's the recolonization and self-colonization there as well. I don't necessarily think that the self-colonization or recolonization is deriving from regionalization or deriving from emphasizing the region. It's more of while universities emphasize the importance of region, and it's almost as if in the back of their mind or in the operations, the global, the Western, it's there, is very dominant. So they cannot forget about this important partners for them, both functionally, but also in other ways. It's from the geopolitics, and even from my interviews with universities in China, they mentioned that, yeah, we want to emphasize the region. That's part of our interest and our strategy to differentiate ourselves from other universities in our internationalization, but we don't get recognized as much by focusing on the region because collaborating with Western countries get to be more recognized, or with more high-ranking universities gets to be more recognized. So it's not necessarily deriving from the risks, not necessarily derives from the regionalization, but it's more from the broader context of Western dominance that is still exists and is still very quite influential. And universities, it's hard for them to not to think about that, even when they are trying to conscientiously to focus on the region. For the question of is coloniality the concept too broad? It refers to the enduring logic. So I'm not sure how to answer that question right now. Like, is it too broad? It might be, but it might be too. We might need more nuances in that to understand for that to understand regionalization per se. And for the second question, are there recognizing the inequality or equalness within the region? And yes, it's very much so. Even when I talk to universities in Southeast Asia, they emphasize that China is it's a very important country that we want to collaborate with. And some mention that Singapore is a country we want to collaborate with, but there are difficulties in collaboration due to logistics, and but there is this inequality within the region. I think that's a very interesting and angle to think about regionalization as well. My research didn't focus on the within region inequality per se, but it's very much present there. And I think it will be very interesting to look at that in the future. How the inequality within the region affect regionalization versus global higher education. Thank you
Great.
for that question.
Pleasure. Thank you, Yemio, for some really thoughtful comments. And I'm sure the coloniality is a concept that we constantly struggle with because it's powerful, but also sort of almost too powerful. But that was a thoughtful response. And I'm not going to take any more time because we've got some great questions in the chat. Thank you all for coming together. I've unmuted you. So perhaps let's start and go through each person in turn. Yusuf, you were first off the mark. Welcome, Yusuf. Do you want to ask a question?
Hello, can you hear me well?
Indeed, you can. Hi, Yusuf.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thank you, Yoyo, for this great presentation. I also read your paper earlier, so it's good that you are presenting, so the discussion starts. My question is more about, you showed some preliminary data, for example, in your presentation. For example, you said generalized, regional university associations, specialized, etc. I specifically paid attention to East Asia and Southeast Asia there. For example, East Asian universities doesn't seem to have so much generalized regional university associations, while Southeast Asia has more of it. So like differences in that percentage and how can I say the nature of regionalization between these different regions. So my question is, you discuss these regions together, right? In your findings and the paper. And when I mean these regions, I mean East Asia, or maybe we can say Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. But overall, East Asia and Southeast Asia tend to demonstrate different cultural and economic indicators. And also your preliminary data also showed an indication of this. So should we really put them together? That's my question, or I don't know. So I want to get your ideas on that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Yusuf.
Thank you, Yusuf. That's a great question and a great critique as well. Yes, it's even from the associations, you will see that And from the literature, I would say that in Southeast Asia, there's more intense regionalization in terms of the efforts. Although from the interviews, the universities seem to tell me a different story, different from a policy perspective. There seems to be a lot of policy interest, but universities are not necessarily interested. But to answer your question directly, I agree that it's problematic to put East and Southeast Asia all together and while neglecting the differences between them. And for the first question that I had from Dr. Mills, there are inequality within the region between East and Southeast Asia. But I put them together because there has been some efforts to link Southeast Asia and East Asia together, like the ASEAN +3, those initiatives. And in Japan, they mentioned that the Southeast Asia is a very important partner. In Hong Kong, the university mentioned that Southeast Asia is very much what they're interested in collaborating with for student mobility and other things in higher education. But so there is some linkage between the two regions, but it's true that probably a more focused study focusing on the nuances within the region or between the two will provide a lot of insights. Thank
Great,
you.
thank
Well, okay, thank you very much. Let me not take any further time. We'll discuss later again. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Yusuf. Rachel, you're sort of continuing this theme about the region. Do you want to come ask your question?
Thank you, Yo-Yo, so much for your presentation. So in listening to your talk, you alluded to, you almost gave me an answer already, but I was thinking about sort of trickle down coloniality and how that may have been expressed within the region between East Asian or within Southeast East Asian countries among each other, and whether even if it wasn't your primary question, did anyone express ideas of recolonization specifically, but amongst each other, and trying to replicate this idea of global higher education in sort of a westernized context, but sort of impressing that amongst their peers.
Yeah, it's very much in line with what we have been discussing, the differences between East Asia, Southeast Asia, and also China, Japan as a more dominant countries in the region. I would say, at least from the interviews, what's notable is that, for example, China is mentioned as an important country that universities, for example, in Southeast Asia, they are very interested in. They didn't express concerns about this, but I would say that power dynamics very much exist in how they think about their internationalization when they also prioritize partnerships with Chinese universities. Another example is from an interview with a Japanese participant, and to me, there was almost an imperial or colonial mindset in terms of they talk about, oh, we had this, and they actually express very explicitly that, oh, we had this history of colonizing other countries in the region. So they felt responsible for they felt responsible that as Japanese university, they wanted to contribute to the region. But in a very implicit way, they also mentioned that we want to help the universities to develop. So at that, I think to your point, kind of also reflects that coloniality within the region, the sense that we want to help. We are the more powerful one, that we want to help you because you are the you're more weak in this relation. So that's a very implicit, and I'm bringing the theoretical perspective in analyzing the interviews yes. So yeah, it's very much exists in the region. And I think it would be really interesting to explore that in the future, how within the region, the inequalities and power dynamics affect the international efforts.
And if this is a interest that you might pursue, maybe how those regional associations foster or mitigate the different types of coloniality within region and beyond. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Rachel. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And it must be similarly a challenge for a global association like the International Association of Universities or the ACU, which of course is very much an imperial origins association. Let's go on. And Wenyi, you had a very thoughtful question. Wenyi, did you want to ask a question, or shall I ask it for you? Oh, she's in the library. Okay, so I'll read it out. No problem at all. And then you can respond as I read it. So she says, "Thanks for amazing works and presentation. I noticed you mentioned Western dominant, which reminds me of Westernization. I was also thinking about the difference between US dominant and Europe dominant. The question, I guess, is about the US as being particularly dominant, while generalizing Europe. But none of the participants mentioned this. So I guess the tension perhaps here is, do you want to talk about, and did your participants distinguish between the US as the most dominant position in the global hierarchy, which is sort of Shah Jahan's position? There is a sort of a hierarchy of status, as opposed to Western more generally. Was that something that came up?
That's very interesting. Thank you for the question, and very nuanced. For the interviews, I would say the U.S. dominance was not mentioned explicitly, so it didn't came up as they talk about being, for example, U.S. is the dominant. But in one interview, I did remember that they mentioned they already had partnerships with European countries, but they haven't had a lot of partnerships with the North American universities. So they mentioned that's one of their priorities in their internationalization next. So that might be related to what you're asking, but there hasn't been any very explicit mention of US being dominant or the differences between US and Europe. And in my analysis, again, I am more generalizing US and Europe, seeing it more as a Western. So that's how I use Western dominance, because they sort of mention Europe, North America as well. So that's how I interpret it. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that people are using shorthands, and so your challenge is knowing when to sort of gloss their shorthands in their conversation, and or to unpick it in your questions and think, right, well, what's really going on here, you know? And I totally can see that universities are keen to collect internationalization networks and points through their MOUs, through their collaborations. So if it's okay, we'll go on to Rachel. Rachel, got a great question here, please. Rachel Brooks.
Thanks, David, and thanks you. Yeah, so my question was about sort of other policy actors, because you talked quite a lot about universities and their perspectives. But I was just wondering, to what extent in the kind of regions that you've been looking at, national governments and other regional bodies beyond RUA sort of shaping what's going on and shaping people's views about it? Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you for the question, Rachel. My research didn't look at other actors, policy actors in regionalization. I mainly focused on universities and how they view the regional collaboration and versus their global engagement. From the literature or from previous research, I showed this in the slides. A Japanese scholar, Hamad, he studied how universities view the policies at a national level on regional collaboration. So there are some interests at the national level or beyond the universities that are trying to have some efforts in regionalization, especially in Southeast Asia. I always see some news that they're trying to build a Southeast Asian higher education area. There are policy incentives to do that. But very interestingly, from my interviews, at least when I talk to universities, they were, to my surprise, they were much less interested in, say, the region. Even though there are to me, from the reading of the literature on the regional policies, that's very dynamic. By universities, they are not as interested in the region. That's one thing that surprised me in Southeast Asia. But I focused more on individual universities in my research.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I mean, that is really interesting that if you're interested in regionalization, you're interested in regional networks, but the universities themselves are seeming to be sort of paying lip service to that more than anything else. Fernanda, you can't ask this question, so I'll read it out for you. Fernanda writes as the Director of the International Relations at UFSC in Brazil, and she asks whether the knowledge produced in the context of academic cooperation promoted by the regional associations is distanced from the colonial matrix of power. So I guess the question probably is around what sorts of knowledge is being created in these participations, in these cooperation. Do you get a sense that these associations are doing their own research, are sort of generating findings about what's going on in their region?
In my research, I did looked at what these regional universities associations are doing, and the most common activities they do is conferences, networks, building networks among the university members. And sometimes trying to create opportunities for academic collaboration, such as trying to create joint degree programs, create opportunities for universities to connect. That's the most common activities among RUAs, these associations. I didn't look at whether they have some activities that are trying to promote research collaboration, so this knowledge exchange. But I didn't look at what knowledge or research they were doing and what type of knowledge is produced by these associations. So I don't think I can directly answer that question from my research.
That's fine. We were always going to ask you questions about things you haven't done. That's part of what happens in research, and it's fine to say, well, look, this is my main focus. But I think, Fernanda, you're absolutely right. It's really interesting to think about when and how associations are generating research and knowledge, or supporting or promoting it. And certainly, you mentioned Latin America in your comment there, promoting research through their associations, and the African Association Universities. My sense will be also is very much trying to promote training and and capacity building, doing an awful lot of work to build a community, if not necessarily commissioning research. But that's really interesting, and a whole other conversation really to be had about what regional associations are doing and their role in the landscape. I'm going to take one last question. Olga, do you want to ask your question? I'm just going to find you so I can unmute you. 1 second. There we are, I found you. Please do come forward and ask your question.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I put 2 notes on the chat. One is about the services, member services these regional associations provide. That gives the priority to higher education institutions. So the more they're active, the more membership commitment and numbers they get. That's based on my experience with some regional associations. The other thing that I would call as a further research area, maybe for you or for us as well, to compare the regional ones with the international ones, because international university associations or like accreditation organizations as well, maybe the rankings organization, global rankings could be added. Now they are also in the scene. So there is really I would call a tough competition going on. It's a challenge for associations to overcome these big chunks of rankings as well as accreditation. Maybe the alignment or some collaboration or cooperation between these that the associations can also provide for their members would increase the value and preference by the institutions. Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you for the comments. Yeah, I always think about because in my research I did find universities that are members, but they are not very actively engaged. So they are members nominally, sort of as this to signal their international orientation. But so there's a question of what are the actual benefits they have they could get from being a member versus was that a more of a nominal, they just trying to show their international orientation. And I also think that it's very interesting to compare regional and more global associations, and is that actually different, or is that very similar for universities or for these associations as well? Thank you for the comment.
Good. That's really interesting. I think there's lots more to do here. I think you've identified a topic that you could really take a long way. I know a bit about the work on the history of some of the associations, and then understanding how that shapes the present feels really important. You have set out as a start really, and I think I hope you carry on in this area and do some more. And I think the more we can hear from parts of the world that are trying to respond to this global dominance, the better. So thank you again, Yo-Yo. Great talk. Next week we are going to be hearing from Akira Shah, who recently finished his doctorate at Oxford, and he's done research on Japanese international baccalaureate programs, and this is the Japanese university response to the pressure to globalize, and they're teaching these IB teacher trainers in Japanese rather than in English. So he raises questions of epistemological imperialism and whiteness. Thank you all again for coming. Join us next week, next time, same place, 2 p.m. Do register. And don't forget to look out for our conference, which is coming up in April. Please do register for that. It's very cheap to register online. It's pretty cheap to come face-to-face if you can and join us in Oxford. £50 face-to-face, 10 or 15 online. And many of you would be most welcome if you could make it to Oxford. Okay, thanks a lot, Yo-Yo. See you next week, everyone. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.